Well, thank you all for coming today. It's such an honour to welcome you all to this panel webinar. I'd like to acknowledge and celebrate the Indigenous peoples and First Australians on whose lands we meet, wherever we are calling in from across Australia and the world today. In my case, I pay my respects to elders of the Ngunnawal people, past, present and emerging, and pay those respects to any Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander people here with us today. In case you haven't yet had the opportunity to attend an ANU alumni event, I'll quickly run through some housekeeping steps. So all attendees have your video and microphones turned off. This helps keep the sound quality clear and reduce interference on the call. But as mentioned, if you can just click the three dots at the top of your name and rename yourself to your industry and your location, that will really help us have a focused discussion this evening. If you have any questions or technical issues throughout the night, you can email alumni@anu.edu.au and the team will assist. Throughout our event today, our moderator may also invite attendees to ask questions live, and our team will unmute you if that is the case. Please wait a few seconds so we can hear your full question. Please note that this meeting is being recorded. If you do not wish to be recorded, please submit your question via the chat function at the bottom of your screen, noting no record in your response. So we will be having a lot of questions and answers this evening. Really encourage you to type your questions and answers through the chat function. We'll have a question and answers portion at the end for attendees, and we look forward to hearing all of your questions at that point. In terms of welcoming you this evening, my name is Alicia Louisa Lillington and I am the co-chair of the ANU Women's Alumni Network. For those of you who are new to the network, ANU WAN is a volunteer alumni-led network, and our mission is to connect, support and empower members through a range of panel discussions, workshops, networking opportunities and online content. We bring together those who identify as female and non-binary, who are alumni from around the world to share and collaborate on ideas, create inspiring and educational events and highlight the achievements of our wonderful and diverse community. Today, ANU WAN, in collaboration with the ANU Alumni Relations team, is proud to host this event as part of the 2022 ANU Alumni Week. The panel discussion tonight is based on this year's International Women's Day theme from UN Women Australia, Changing Climates, Equality Today for Sustainability Tomorrow. For this webinar, we will be joined by our expert panel members in conversation with our moderator, Dr. Shamura Mirza. We'll be discussing the impact climate change has on our community with a focus on women and the role women might play in bringing about impactful change. They will be considering both the impact of individuals as well as the impact on a macro level, looking at corporate responsibilities. Without further ado, I'd like to introduce you your moderator for today's panel, Dr. Shamura Mirza. Shamura is a Bangladeshi Australian scientist. She completed her PhD and postdoctoral research in medical science and biophysics, respectively, from the ANU. Throughout her work as a senior scientist working for the Therapeutic Goods Administration, Shamura has continued to work for the well-being of culturally and linguistically diverse community and its members, and is Deputy Chair of the COLD Network Committee in the Department of Health, Government of Australia. In 2017, she started a small volunteer-run not-for-profit organisation, Sitara Story, with the aim to help women in our community build confidence, mental and physical well-being, and as a result, empower them to be the best versions of themselves. Sitara Story has been recognised by the ACT Government and ABC Canberra for its contributions to communities through the 2021 ACT Mental Health Month Award and Canberra Community Spirits Award finalist nomination given to Sitara Story Secretary and co-founder, Dr. Shamura Mirza. That's all from me this evening. I'm just so excited to have you all here tonight. The purpose, really is to bring together our community and have a really meaningful discussion. Over to you, Dr. Sharma.
Thank you so much, Alicia, for your kind words. Uh, I would like to thank all our expert panelists and a very warm welcome to today's panel discussion on climate change and gender equality. Before I start the questions, I would like to give some brief introduction about our panelists, although I know that the attendees have read this wonderful description about our panelists from the ANU website. I would like to start with Dr. Rebecca Colvin. So Beck Colvin is a social scientist and senior lecturer with the Resources, Environment, and Development Group at the ANU Crawford School of Public Policy. Beck researches the social and political dimensions of contentious issues associated with climate policy and energy transition. Her research is focused on understanding the complexity of how different people and groups engage with social policy and political conflict about climate and energy issues, particularly through the theoretical lens of the social identity approach. Fascinating. So most recently, she has published research on how local residents' policy priorities for economical diversification of the coal-producing Upper Hunter region and patterns of aggregate public opinion about climate change in Australia. This year, she's expected to commence work on an Australian Research Council discovery project that seeks to understand the influence of unconventional advocates like farmers, business people, and political conservatives on public opinion about climate policy. That sounds really interesting. Thank you so much, Beck, for joining our discussion tonight. Then we have Anika Reynolds. She is a young leader in the Australian climate justice movement and a non-binary advocate. They are the CEO and founder of Green Law, a youth-led research institute leveraging the vision of the next generation of legal researchers and lawyers to tackle the climate crisis. Anika is also an inaugural youth chair of Environment and Human Rights at Australian Lawyers for Human Rights. In 2021, Anika was awarded the Honorable Michael Kirby ACCMG Pinnacle Scholarship for their leadership within the queer community. They're a recognized writer with words in New Mandela, International Law Association reporter, Women's Agenda, the Canberra Times, and Pro Bono News, and have provided interviews in major outlets like The Guardian. Anika has previously been a consultant for major environmental organizations, including the Australian Conservation Foundation, a researcher in federal parliament, and worked in private law. Amazing. And last but not the least, we have our Mariana Gorman. Mariana works with organizations who want to transition to a sustainable economy. She's a non-executive director specializing in climate governance and risk. She has previously held roles as an advisor to the Prime Minister and Climate Change Minister at the Clean Energy Finance Corporation and at the World Bank in Washington. She has worked on national climate change policy and been involved in many governmental and international climate change negotiations. She is the Chief Executive Women International Climate Change Negotiation. She's a Chief Executive Women Sustainability Scholar and was awarded the Ross Conrad Prize for Master of Climate Change Studies at the ANU. Thank you so much, Mariana, for joining us tonight. Again, a very warm welcome to our panel discussion tonight. So I would like to ask the questions first with Anika. Anika, you there? Can you hear me well?
Yep, I can hear you.
It's fascinating that what you have been doing, for last few years. Could you please tell us, why did you choose to work in an area relating to the environment?
Big question to start us off. I think what really drove me to work in the environmental space is climate change and concerns for the future of our climate. And in recent years, the biodiversity crisis has also been a big motivator. And I think it's a sense that we have so much to lose in these coming decades. And in fact, reading about the bleaching of the Great Barrier Reef in the last couple of weeks, we have so much to lose now from environmental degradation and from climate change. And so that fear is what really drove me in the first instance. But in the last few years, it has also been a sense of opportunity and hope that has driven me, because what so many of us, I think, see in the headline news about climate change, about the loss of the Great Barrier Reef, slowly but surely about loss of species, I don't think enough attention is given to the fact that we also have an incredible opportunity at this point in time to be crafting a more equitable, sustainable society going forwards. And that's a really, really exciting opportunity. Looking at renewable energy alone, for the first time in human history, since we industrialized, we have the opportunity to move away from oligarchical, top-down methods of energy production. Rooftop solar panels allow a democratic form of energy production for the first time in modern history. And that is a beautiful thing to be a part of, and an opportunity that future generations aren't going to get the same way that we are. We are transitioning, and so we have the power to make that transition a really equitable and sustainable one. So it's the fear of what's to come, but also the hope of what we can do to address that has really driven me to work in the space.
Thank you so much, Anika. That's quite fascinating. My next question is for Mariana. So Mariana, being an advisor to the Prime Minister and Climate Change Minister, and also working on the National Climate Change Policy for a while, could you just let us know that how has the climate changed in the last 5 to 10 years alone? I mean, I'm sure that you have got the idea, Nurse.
Yeah, I guess we've seen the IPCC come out with 2 reports, one a few weeks ago and one last year, that really shows that it's changing a lot faster. It's warming a lot faster than previous scientific assessments had shown. And the impacts of that warming are coming a lot harder than we had previously anticipated. You really don't have to kind of look very far but our own backyard to kind of see that. The Black Summer bushfires were the worst that we've ever seen in history. We had over 18 million hectares burnt. 33 people lost their lives in the fire. 445 died from the smoke inhalation, and thousands were admitted to hospital with respiratory problems because of all the smoke. We lost, I think it was about 3 billion animals. So that kind of thing is happening, and we've only reached 1.1 degree of warming, and that's already happening. This kind of, almost just in some ways it looked like end of the world, some of the visions and footage and experiences that people saw during the bushfires. And now, with the floods, and we've lost over 20 lives with the floods, and I think over 30,000 homes have been impacted. So you can really see that these types of events that have never ever occurred before are occurring more often, more frequently, and more severely than ever before. And it would be nice to say that it was unforeseen, and that it's it's unprecedented in that it's never happened before, but it's not unforeseen. When I sat in the ANU climate modelling labs doing like the fire modelling as part of the climate change vulnerability program, that was 2015. We were writing in all of the kind of variables and what the output of that would be, and you could almost see Black Summer coming just in the numbers, and it was scary. It was the scariest day I've ever had. So it's quite scientists can see what's happening, and it's
absolutely. Yeah, no, you're right. It's quite worrying. I mean, you just mentioned about the fire modeling. So could you please explain that, a little bit? What do you mean by fire modeling? So did you model the whole thing using scientific tools or technology?
Yeah. So you can basically put in different levels of warming, levels of emissions, and then you can look to see, well, then how many days are left where the conditions are available to backburn. And as the fire period becomes longer, the period when you can backburn, because you can only backburn when it's, not raining and when it's not too windy and not too hot and not too dry, becomes shorter. So your ability to prepare becomes much shorter. And then the potential length of the fire season becomes a lot longer because these catastrophic days where you have very, very hot, dry conditions with high wind become more frequent. So you can kind of see, okay, catastrophic day, and you can see Black Summer just in looking at these models.
Yeah, that's quite boring. Thank you, Mariana. Before we ask the next question, I would just like to tell the attendees that if you could just type and save questions on the side and paste in chat when we enable the chat function, and it will be enabled when the question and answer starts. So it's for the attendees. Just save your questions for a while now. So my next question, I would like to ask this question to Anika. As Mariana just mentioned about the global warming and how the temperatures are increasing. So as I know that emissions need to be reduced by 45% by 2030 and reach net zero by 2050, according to the UN, to keep global warming to no more than 1.5 degrees centigrade. I think it's something called for in the Paris Agreement. So, and what we understand that there are too many countries that are really not on track. So can we still hope, whether that goal can be achieved? I mean, so what's your opinion about that?
I think it's a hard question because on all accounts, scientifically, I'll get to the legal dimension of it in a second, but scientifically we are not on track to meet 1.5, and it will be very, very difficult, dare I say impossible to do that at this point in time. But as the Glasgow Climate Pact outcome last year kind of said, that taking in tally all of the pledges that have come out to date from the Glasgow Climate Pact, we're looking at 1.8. And I think that really shows that until scientists are conclusively saying we're at 1.5 or we're at 1.6, there is still hope and opportunity to be changing things. Ultimately, climate change is an incredibly complex scientific phenomena, and I don't profess to understand the climate science in detail. I come at it from a policy perspective, but we know that we can be rapidly reducing emissions from a policy perspective. The technology is there. It's about the political will and the ability to craft systems of governance that facilitate that really fast transition. That is all within our control over the next decade. And so I do think that there is, still grounds for hope. And I think more importantly for us in the climate space, whether we hit 1.5 degrees or not is a difference in damage, not a difference in motivation to do something. Ultimately, we are talking about the livability of our planet for future centuries, millennia, and what that looks like, and the species and the biodiversity that is on that planet. What happens in this next couple of decades and century is really important about what we're going to see at the end, what planet we're going to be left with when we hit zero emissions, which I am really confident we will as a society eventually hit that. And so it's a question of what can we do to limit the harm that our future generations are going to have to be building back from? And that is not so tied to 1.5 degrees. The end of the road is not 1.5 degrees. As devastating as going to 2 degrees or higher would be, that doesn't take away from the urgent work that we need to do this decade and in future decades.
Thank you, Anika. Beck, while I was learning about you, I got very, very interested in the research work that you have been doing, and you are trying to understand the influence of unconventional advocates like farmers, and then business people and political conservatives on public opinion about climate policy. That's very interesting because I'm originally from Bangladesh, and what happens in those countries, farmers actually don't have any voice, to be honest. It's mostly the industry. They can influence the governments, and that's why climate policy is a mess, to be honest. Anyway, I'm coming back to the International Women's Day theme this year. And this year it's changing climates, equality today for a sustainable tomorrow. Apart from the, understanding the influence of those unconventional advocates, so what does this theme mean to you? The impact of climate change on women.
Thanks, Sharma. So it's a big question. I think, Anika, you said earlier it's a big question. I'm going to steal your line and say it again now. This is a big question. But one of the things that we know about climate change is that we might talk about global impacts or something like a global average, but the distribution of the impacts of climate change are not equal across every person. They're not equal based on the place that people are in, and particularly not equal based on the life situation that people are in. So as long as we have a pre-existing level of inequality, if there are certain people or groups of people in particular who are disadvantaged relative to others, those are the people who are going to be most profoundly affected by climate change. So I think I'll steal another one of Anika's lines because it was a good one, but Anika, you were kind of talking about how this period that we're in now is really critical because we're designing our structures, our systems, we're laying the pathway to the future. So we have a choice when we deal with climate change. Do we want climate change to be an issue that we address and everything else stays as it is, including those pre-existing levels of inequality? Or do we recognize that climate change forces us to confront some of these existing inequalities and find ways that we can address both the impacts of climate change and some of these pre-existing levels of inequality? And so when we look at gender and climate change, to me, this demands that we look at other aspects of inequality as well. If we recognize the logic that women's voices and women's decision-making power have been excluded from places of power, then how can we possibly stop there and say that's the only thing that matters? It drives us to look at other forms of exclusion or subordination. And the example you gave of the farmers actually not having much of a voice at all because of the influence of industry is just one of those examples. So one of the things that's really challenging with climate change, and I can't say that I have the answer on how it is that we should engage with this issue, but it is, how do we address the urgency of a lot of the impacts like Mariana was talking about, the floods and the fires, while also making sure that we're dealing with some of these longer term chronic issues at the same time. So the research project that you mentioned, looking at unconventional advocates, is really exploring how is it that we can make climate change something that every person recognizes is an issue that it is okay for them to care about. Because in certain places we have people, for a whole range of complicated reasons, think that climate change is something that those upstart urban-based environmentalists care about. They're not like me and I don't like them, and they don't have my interests at heart. And that's part of the complication that we have to work our way through. So it's one of these big issues. And if we look at climate change as something in isolation, maybe we can address that. But actually, as Anika highlighted to us, when we're progressing toward a more sustainable and critically more equitable future, is that the disruption that climate change is causing, but also the innovation that it's prompting us to engage in, is an opportunity to address some of those aspects of equality as well, of equitability.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. That actually answers part of my question, but that leads to my next question. As I just mentioned, that I'm originally from Bangladesh, and this country is now facing incredible danger. I don't know whether you were aware of the fact that because of the sea level rise, and I would like to know the impacts of displacement and climate change on women and girls and other minorities in countries like Bangladesh. And that question is actually for you and Anika, and either of you could answer that question, that would be great.
Well, I'm happy to start off with that, and then I can hand to Anika and Mariana. And Sharma, it sounds like you've perhaps got many more insights that you can share as well, even though you're asking the question. So again, it goes to that question of those pre-existing levels of vulnerability and inequality and disadvantage. I think Bangladesh and the Delta area is where there's going to be a massive amount of people whose homes, whose livelihoods are going to be disrupted. We can talk about the big numbers, and the big numbers highlight the scale of the issue, but sometimes it's not until we actually think about what does this mean for the life of a person that we can start to grapple with the true human cost. So this could be people being dispersed all across the world. They might come up against some, trying to think of the words to use to not get myself in trouble, but draconian immigration and border management policies. Not that I would point the finger at any country in particular on that. But they might end up split from their families. They'll end up in new places where they're disconnected from the land that they know, especially when it is people who are already often those who have the least. They might be people who do subsistence farming or something like that. Take them to a new place and they are in an entirely new environment. There's so much learning to do, new languages to learn, new connections to make. So when you think about it from the human cost, it's a responsibility to recognize the numbers and the scale, but I think also to look at what does that mean when it's compounding so many people's lives and the costs that will be borne by so many people. Maybe I don't want to monopolize, so I'll head across to you, Anika, if you'd like to extend on that.
Thank you, Beth. But Mariana, do you perhaps want to say something first? Because I know that you haven't had the chance to speak for a little bit. So,
I guess I completely agree with what Beck said, and I think one of the interesting things that I learned while I was at ANU was I was working with a girl who was at the Ministry of Environment at Kiribati, which is one of the countries that's forecast to kind of be hardest hit first by climate change and is literally sinking. Because it is such a small island state and, only maybe a couple of kilometres, not even wide. So you've got sea on either side. The president in, I think, 2015 announced that he would just close the country by 2050, which kind of seems just surreal that, the Prime Minister here would just say, hey, guys, like climate change is going to get us. We're going to close the country by 2050. But his plan, and I think it really speaks to what he was hoping to do for the women and girls of that country, was to try and make sure that they weren't left as climate refugees and to try and train them in the professions that were going to be most needed in nearest neighbours. So places like Australia and New Zealand, what skills are they most likely to need so that they can migrate as skilled migrants, not as climate refugees? And so brought over a lot of the teachers and nurses and even like the nurses union to come over and try and teach his population some of the skills that are most sought after and educate them with the degrees that they'll need to be able to migrate. And I think that kind of comes into play very much with the education levels and access to education that women and girls in countries like Bangladesh face and the huge barriers. And trying to look at that education not only from the economic point of view, but very much from a security level and from a climate change lens as to why it is so critical that women and girls are offered these opportunities.
Thanks, Mariana. Anika, do you want to shed any light on the topic?
Yeah, I might round out the discussion because I think both Beck and Mariana have made some really important points about this. I think the first one that I'll make is I note that the three of us as panelists are from the global north, and I've personally have lived in Australia all of my life. I'm clearly very white. My background is white Australian, and I think it is important for us to acknowledge that the narrative around climate refugees and the displacement that people in the global south are going to face in the millions, as has been acknowledged by both Beck and Mariana. There is another dimension to that story, and that is that this is not something natural, out of control of anyone that has led to this level of displacement. This is blatant extractivism, ongoing greed from the global north, both historical and contemporary. The vast majority of carbon emissions have been caused by global north countries and has often gone hand in hand with colonization of the global south. So I think a second dimension to the displacement that people are going to face in climate change is the responsibility of global north countries to take in climate refugees and to, more importantly, invest in loss and damage mechanisms. Because at the end of the day, to take the example of Kiribati or Tuvalu or many of the low-lying Pacific nations, climate refugees, the idea of climate refugees is a horrifying spectre for a lot of these nations. These are communities that do not want to leave their lands, and that is something that is very consistently said. And I think it is an injustice for the global north to paint itself as a saviour for taking in climate refugees when it is our actions that have caused that loss in the first place. And when there are still avenues to be, dredging up sand, to be uplifting these communities, to be looking at regional migration patterns within countries and to be supporting that in a way that doesn't lead to violence and loss of opportunities and economic insecurity, particularly for women and girls. And might I add, also for transgender and gender diverse individuals who face exceptional barriers in natural disasters in the global south, and who also really struggle when dealing with the highly gender segregated nature of a lot of migration that happens, and a lot of refugee processing that happens by the global north. So I think that's the way I would like to round out that point, is that I absolutely agree with everything that Beck and Mariana have said about the scale of the problem, the human face of the problem, and what we can be doing to support people. But I do think that us sitting here at a panel, being run by ANU, being run by Australia's national university, there must be an acknowledgement that the cause of the problem, fundamentally the displacement of millions of people over the coming decades, is the global north. And that we have a responsibility, not because we are being, good human citizens that are engaging in acts of charity, but because we owe these actions to our fellow humans that we have done wrong to be addressing this problem.
Thank you, Anika. I mean, as you mentioned about the greed of the global north. So, Mariana, the next question is actually for you. I read in The Guardian that just 100 companies are responsible for 71% of greenhouse gas emissions stem from big business. So what can we do to influence corporations? I mean, Australia is a developed country, and obviously developing countries, countries like Bangladesh, Pakistan, Sri Lanka, or India, I mean, they don't have that much power. But as a country, and as a country of Australia, what can we do to influence corporation, and what should corporations do to change this situation?
I've actually been really surprised with what Australian companies have done in the last 6 to 9 months. The scale at which they've been moving has been a lot faster than, they're moving ahead of government,
That's great.
far ahead of government in Australia. And that's the first time that we've seen that really happen, because there is a changing shift between kind of us and them. Being, new energy, old energy, and a realization that us can become them. You only have to look at a company like Fortescue, which is now doing Fortescue Future Industries, a very heavy emitter in mining, iron ore. Its products are used to produce a lot of emissions in steel. And, they have realized that there is a huge opportunity, multi-billion dollar opportunity in green hydrogen, and they've employed hundreds of people, including the Deputy Governor of the Reserve Bank, in the last 6 months. Like, when I had a look on LinkedIn, I think I saw at one point 300 job ads to work in Fortescue Future Industries. They are realizing there is an opportunity for us to become them, and it doesn't have to be a fight. If you look at all the power stations that existed, the coal-fired power stations that existed, say, 10 years ago, and where they are now, a lot of them are actually have transitioned into solar farms or batteries, or have plans to transition into renewable hubs Liddell is the most recent example. The things that they've got planned there, they've got almost every single type of electricity, waste to energy, solar thermal, batteries, green hydrogen. The whole station isn't going to close down. It's going to be converted. So companies are starting to realize that, and that's because investors have been pushing them, financiers have been pushing them, and their employees have been pushing them. And you can't, Andrew Charlton, who's the one of the heads of Accenture, a global consulting firm, said, you know, like, people don't want to work for a company that they're not proud of to chat about at a barbecue. Like, they're not so much interested, you know, this next generation that's entering the workforce aren't so much interested in the biggest pay packet. They're interested in working for something that they're passionate about and something that they believe in a company whose values align with them. And so companies are realizing that if they, you know, don't have these, if they're just working for profit and they don't have broader social and environmental aims, then they're not going to attract staff. Suppliers aren't going to work for them. If you look at all the law firms, PR firms, engineering, construction firms that are now just saying, nah, we're not going to work with you if your business isn't sustainable or isn't aligned with the Paris pathway, it's hard to put out tenders and get people to work with you. You've got your super funds that are now turning up at shareholder meetings and that they're pushing this action. So I feel like there is a lot going on in this space. It actually gives me a lot of optimism. I think the best thing that we can be asking of all of our Australian corporations is to sign up to what's known as the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures. And that kind of enables us, that's basically disclosing climate risk, emissions, and what they're doing to tackle it. Once we have that information, and lots of companies, like nearly half the ASX, are volunteering to do this. Once we have that information, we can start to make decisions about that information as investors, as customers, as employees. And once we start paying attention to that, it starts to really gain momentum.
Well, that's great to hear that the companies are doing a lot in this area, but I wonder what the governments are doing. Are they pushing the companies, making great policies? What I can hear from you, that the investors are pushing them, the clients are pushing them, the finances are pushing them, but what about the government? And, can we expect more from the government to influence the companies to do more?
I think internationally, like you've seen a lot of negative feedback about Australia's international commitments I say that the corporations are really taking some great action. They are. And I like the fact that they are, because they're doing it somewhat voluntarily, although there is huge profits in transitioning and being the first to transition. So, there's two reasons for them doing that. They want to stay competitive. They're not doing nearly enough to get us on a pathway to 1.5 degrees, though. They are signing up to it, and they're saying that they want to set those pathways, but the businesses that they're running right now won't get us on that pathway. And that's where you really do need the government to come in and set harder enforcement mechanisms that provide more of a carrot for transitioning and more of a stick for being lagging behind. One of the things that people don't really understand is that the Abbott government introduced, was it the Abbott government? It was a policy under the Abbott government that was introduced under Turnbull, this safeguard mechanism. It applies to 215 of Australia's biggest polluters. It's basically a cap, and it says, if you're one of the biggest emitters in the country, you've got a cap of how much emissions you can release. And once you go over that cap, then you have to pay and get like a Australian carbon ACCU, like a carbon offset. So they basically have a kind of cap on these companies and how much they can emit, that operates in effect like a carbon price. All of that infrastructure is there. The way to account for these emissions, monitor these emissions is all there. The companies that are liable is all there. There's only one small thing that needs to be changed, and it's just that cap lowered. the Business Council of Australia, the Grattan Institute, and many other organisations have come up with some ways to just tinker with this policy and make it much more effective in driving that transition and providing that carrot and stick approach. That means that businesses that really reduce emissions below their competitors can get some rewards, they can get some credits that they can then trade and use, and that those that go above are penalised for it. It makes it more of an incentive for you to look at abatement options, and it makes those abatement options more cost effective. That's the policy that the Labor Party is taking to the next election. As far as I'm aware, the coalition has ruled out doing that, but it does have pretty widespread support. Will that get us to 1.5 degrees? I think we probably need a lot more than that, but I think it's a pretty good place to start.
That's great to hear, Mariana. So Beck, so now, as individuals or as a community, how do we change to, how do we mitigate this climate change? How do we manage this, worrying risk that we are facing today as an individual or as a community?
Thanks for the question. And it's interesting, the phrasing that you've used, as an individual or as a community, because that's quite a live area of debate, discussion about what are the pathways to see change on the scale that's required to address climate change. So individual behaviour change, the sorts of consumer behaviours that we might make, transport decisions, diet decisions, travel, all sorts of things that we can do. These things do matter. But as maybe it was Anika or Mariana, I can't remember who made the point earlier, there is a very long way to go between where we're at now and what the best available evidence tells us we need to be at to have a safe and livable climate. So these individual behaviour changes matter, but where the big stakes are is where we all put our hands together on big levers and pull them together. And that's where acting as a community is really important. So one of the reasons that the individual changes matter is that we know, especially from environmental psychology research, is that participating in those individual behaviours has a really important psychological role of saying, I'm the sort of person who's doing the right thing by the climate, by the environment. And that becomes a motivator for participating in some of the bigger picture things, which can be about doing the sort of work that both Anika and Mariana are doing, looking at the influence that you have in bigger systems, in corporations, in a space of governance. And we can even look at some good examples. So the TCFD example that you're talking about, Mariana, made me think about the story of, I suppose, how climate risk became such a unifying concept in Australia. And you can probably fill in the details a bit better than me, but I think it's kind of instructive here because it speaks to the legal space, it speaks to research, and it speaks to the corporate sector. So Hutley and was it Hartford Davison? Yeah, okay, good. The people who know what's going on are nodding at me, so that's reassuring. Produced a legal opinion back in 2016 and then updated it in 2019, indicating that under the Corporations Act, company directors should be expected to incorporate climate risk into their decision making. Please correct me if I get important technical terms wrong from my non-legal, non-corporate lay perspective here. But that then triggered a response from Jeff Summerhayes of APRA, the Australian Prudential Regulations Authority, indicating, yes, we expect that the, insurance, finance, superannuation sector should be taking climate risk into account. And all of these shifts haven't just landed from the research. So part of that basis was saying that the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change has produced persuasive enough evidence that climate change is a real thing and it should be acted upon. That went through the legal space to have an influence on the corporate world. But of course, those shifts in the corporate world have also reoriented the way that powerful and influential actors in the public sphere engage with climate change. So when we see big companies that we might think of traditionally as being polluting companies starting to shift their position, the Business Council of Australia even adopting what you would say is a fairly surprising position on climate change given the position that they'd adopted a decade or so ago. These give cues to other people about is climate change something that is worthy of my concern? Is climate change something that matters to people like me? And so the more that we have these opinion leaders starting to explicitly engage with climate change, the more that is kind of, there's better terms than this, but mainstreaming climate change is an issue for lots of people to care about. I think we're starting to see some of the returns in the way that Australians, and I'll just talk about Australians because this is where my research knowledge is based. I'm not sure about changes in other parts of the world, but in Australian public opinion, how Australians are thinking about climate change. So a decade ago, 2012, we were as divided as you could get on climate change in Australia along political lines. Now, around, well, the latest data that I'm drawing on was actually collected in the second half of 2019, but we've got 80% of Australian voters across the political spectrum saying action on climate change is important. So there's this system of interacting moving parts that includes the legal space, the corporate space, obviously government, but also how they influence individual people and feeling like they can be part of the solution is an important factor there. And that goes back to that question of individual behavior change as well. So what we hope is that we can do maybe the small scale things, and we can kind of build up the muscles that we need to feel like actually we have some power to lay those pathways or the stones in the pathway toward a better future. But that by exercising those muscles, it powers us up to work together on some of those broader societal changes. So of course, if we have, now we've got the commitment to net zero from the government by 2050 for Australia. As Anika pointed out earlier, there's a difference between pledges and commitments. And so for Australia, our public debate has for a long time been quite polarized, as in climate change is a real thing and we should do something about it, versus it's not real, or it's not urgent enough, or it's not a big enough issue for us. So as we're shifting to a broader engagement with the reality of climate change and the need to act, it's going to create perhaps a more challenging environment to check that policies, that statements, that pledges that are being made are genuinely being followed up by meaningful action. So those of us that have followed or participated in climate policy debates, we might think this is great, things are moving ahead, and it is great that things are moving ahead, but we've got to shift focus from getting climate change on the agenda and legitimately on the agenda to having genuine, serious policy responses and across different sectors, not just in the government sector. So Mariana's comments about the TCFD approach speaks to that.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Beck. And Beck, Anika, and Mariana, I had such an enlightening experience tonight, discussing with all of you. And I wish I could have asked you more questions, but I have to go to the question and answer session now. I need to allow the attendees to ask questions. I'm sure that they have lots of questions. So I would like to request the attendees to ask questions, just to copy the questions in the chat section. We are going to enable the chat function now. So I think it's already been turned on. So feel free to write the question in the chat area if you have any question. I'm just going to give a couple of minutes to see whether they have questions. While I'm waiting for the questions to arrive, I have another question for all the panelists together. So how do you remain connected to ANU? I mean, I'm sure that you all love to be connected, with the ANU community. So other than teaching or joining panel discussions like this tonight, so how do you remain connected to the ANU community?
Since I'm an employee of the university, I might leave it up to Anika and Mariana to speak to this one. Although I'll say we always love people to stay connected with us.
Oh, I was going to say, I only graduated like 3 months ago, so I'm probably also not the best person. I would really encourage people that one way to stay connected is where opportunities arise to participate in student work or to supervise student work and volunteers. So throughout my time at law school, I had a series of incredible experiences with ANU alumni who were volunteer MOOC coaches or who were involved in our student advocacy work. And that paid dividends to us as students, but it also meant, I think for the alumni, that an opportunity to continue to build on some of the really important public interest work that we do at the university, including in the climate change space. So not from personal experience, but I encourage everyone to get involved in that side of things.
I'm in the Sunshine Coast, the land of the Gubby Gubby people. So I don't get to Canberra as much as I'd like, but I do try and kind of catch up with some of my professors when I do go down to go to Parliament. And I try and read a lot of their work and use their work when I'm doing policy making. Because I know that they've done the research and looked at the impacts on things like the electricity sector or emissions. And some of the ideas that they come up with are pretty clever, and try and incorporate it where I can.
Thank you, Mariana. I'm just gonna ask another thing to all the panelists before I hand over this to Alicia. Do you have any final piece of advice, comments, or anything you would like to share with our audience tonight? You can start, in alphabetical order, probably Anika, and then Beck, and then Mariana. So please share any piece of advice that you would like to share with everyone tonight.
Big question. I think I'll keep things substantive on the topic of what this year's International Women's Day really should have been about, changing the climate, or what that means for gender equality, and from a gender diverse perspective as a non-binary person. I think it is a really important note to be made that one of the great opportunities with climate change and with the innovative society-wide solutions that we need is an opportunity to really address some of the gnarly elements of gender equality that we haven't been able to address so far. Things like persistent stereotyping of different genders and pigeonholing people into certain roles, issues with violence and safety and economic security. These are all things that are both worsened by climate change, but that also gives us a greater impetus to really be addressing them in deep and meaningful ways. And women and non-binary people and trans voices have a lot to offer to sustainable and fair solutions, caring and compassionate solutions to the climate crisis. It is no accident, I think, that many of our leaders in the NGO sector, and particularly local leaders in the global south, are women and non-binary people, because those voices really address the problem of climate change in a comprehensive way beyond technological solutions. It's about getting at the heart of the inequalities that have led to climate change and that continue to perpetuate the problem of climate change and environmental degradation. So I think this panel has, really showed us what women and non-binary voices and trans voices can be offering to this discussion and the perspectives that they bring.
Thank you, Anika. Beck, do you have any comment to share with us tonight?
I'll take a much more narrow view than the great comments that Anika's just shared. And I suppose speaking to the people that are here, like Mariana, your earlier comments about, I don't think you used the word despair, but the overwhelm you felt when you were doing the climate modelling and seeing what the future holds. That's a really heavy burden for everyone who looks with open eyes at what the evidence is telling us about climate change. And that's just looking at the impacts, not even taking into account those broader, complex social issues, like Shama, your comments about There are people in Bangladesh who are looking like they're going to be displaced by the impacts of climate change, that additional level of suffering that gets put on top of the direct impacts. It's really difficult to keep your head in that space for a long time. And something that's important is, if you want to be part of the solution to climate change, you have to straddle that space between seeing what the evidence is telling us, which isn't a pretty picture at all, but making sure that you take care of yourself and that you look after your own well-being. Part of what's so important there is having strong networks of social support, people who you can speak to, people who you can cry to when you need to, who you can feel like you're standing shoulder to shoulder against something big. You're not there on your own. And so I suppose that links back to that question of staying connected with the ANU. The network that you have of fellow graduates from the ANU is a great place to find those people. So I think just on that personal note, it's hard to look at what the future looks like it's going to be, but it's important to do it. But to be able to keep doing it and to be part of the solution, you still have to take care of your own well-being.
Thank you, Beck. And Mariana, so I would really like to know your comment, tonight, or whatever comment you have that you would like to share with the audience tonight.
There's a question in the chat, so maybe I might use
yeah, sure,
that before we wrap up to try and answer one of the audience questions. It's just about how has domestic violence been considered. We saw major increases during COVID, and climate crisis seems it will only increase with food, water, shelter. I think that's something we haven't unpacked a lot tonight, but when we talked about the unequal impacts of climate change, certainly when you're talking about a country more like Australia, that's definitely one of the biggest impacts and reasons that we'll see an unequal impact for women and gender diverse groups rather than men. We've seen that, as you said, during COVID. The last floods, the schools closed, the childcare centres closed, our workplaces closed. And that's where, when you are a victim of domestic violence and you have to go drop off the kids at childcare, there's somebody there that can notice if you're crying, notice if you're distressed, you don't turn up to school, or you do turn up to school and you're scared and you don't have your phone, you don't have your wallet. That's where people can notice those things, and they can pick up and they can say, hey, I can get you some petrol, I can get you some food. Unfortunately, at our school, we saw domestic violence happen on the street as a woman's car was attacked as she was picking up her child. That's where people can see it happen. So when you close down all of those places that women have to go to each day, and you say, please stay at home for your own safety for 4 or 5 days, and that was people all across Southeast Queensland, all across New South Wales, people that could potentially get out, but they were told to stay home. You're making some of those women in the most unsafe situations they could possibly be, without anybody to be there to check in on them. And that's something we've really got to keep our mind on. And that's why it's so important that we have women at the decision-making tables when it comes to reconstruction and rebuilding efforts, so that they can start to look at things like evacuation centres and look at those as intervention points for women's mental health, for their safety, and make sure that we're rebuilding back a better and more equal society where there are more safety nets than we had before.
Thank you, Mariana. No, you're absolutely right. I mean, I have been working with these kind of women for a while now, and there are lots of climate refugees, to be honest, and domestic violence is a burning issue in that arena. I wish I could have talked about it more, but we're running out of time. So I'm just handing over this to Alicia. So before that, I would like to thank all of you for this wonderful discussion tonight. Thank you. Over to Alicia.
Thank you, Shama, and thank you for your fantastic moderating.
Yes, thank you all. That was a very insightful discussion. I have posted in the chat there, if you are experiencing any of those issues, please visit 1-800-RESPECT.org.au, because I know that these issues are prevalent, and please get the support that you need. I really encourage you to do so. I know it's a bit of a sad note. We were sort of looking to take a photo of everyone. If you do feel comfortable to come on camera, all of the attendees tonight, I'd invite you at this moment to turn your camera on. We'd love to see many of your faces. And as we're doing that, I'd just like to share a little bit more about the ANU Women's Alumni Network. So we are a volunteer-led network, and the purpose of what we do is really to connect back with women and non-binary ANU alumni. We host regular events and have panels, and we want to connect with intersection of all of our alumni. So really encourage you to join us on our Facebook group, also our LinkedIn group. You can email us if you have any suggestions of what you'd like to see as we kick off ANU Alumni Week this week. Rafia, did you want to take a photo now?
Sounds good. Thanks, Alicia. So just at our 1, 2, 3, give it 3 seconds and just cheese everyone. That's it. Thank you so much for that.
Thank you. And again, I'd love to thank the panelists and moderator this evening, Shalma, Beck, Anika and Mariana. Thank you so much for your time and insights. I think there's a lot of things there that we can do to work to address, well, to do things against climate change and do what we can. Sounds like a big challenge, but it's just amazing to connect with you and hear your insights. And I think when we connect back with our community, we just see the talent and the depth of knowledge of a lot of our alumni and staff members at ANU, and it's really inspiring, and it sparks a lot of ideas. It makes you want to come back and do a postgrad, right? So thank you all very much. Thank you everyone for attending tonight. We really appreciate your time this evening.